Now that you have a fairly decent understanding of how to actually work with data on the file system within your Windows Phone device by using the storage file and storage folder mechanisms, there's another specialized instance of being able to store data and retrieve it from the file system, and that has to do with actually using settings. So in this example, I'm going to take you through a very simple way to create settings, or in other words, name value pairs, in order to actually save that data to the file system and then retrieve it. So this would be good for something like application settings or maybe user settings within an application where you can change certain aspects of either your UI or the functionality or things based on what the consumer or what the end user wants to see within their application. So I have a very simple UI here. Again, I have a text box on the top, which is going to allow us to type in a setting name, and then another text box below that's going to allow us to type in a value. Then I have two buttons, a button that's going to save that setting, a button that's going to retrieve all the settings and ultimately populate them in a list view that's found here on the bottom, so you'll be able to see all the settings that have been saved to the local file system. So now if I start to go into these buttons in my code behind file, I have a similar situation as I did before. I have two event handlers here that are handling those clicks. Now the mechanism for actually handling these settings is somewhat a little less complicated than doing these storage files and storage folders, merely because there's not a lot of saving and things going on. It's just kind of happening for you, so you're not doing a lot of read and writes and streams and all that kind of thing, so you don't have to worry about that type of complexity. So now when we come into and actually click our save button, we want to grab the name of the setting as well as the value. So we'll say setting name is going to be equal to text setting name dot text, and then we'll get the setting value. Now you can obviously do some defensive coding here and make sure that these are populated, maybe do some validation or something like that, but in our case we're just going to assume that the data is actually there. So the first thing I want to do is grab that name value pair, and you might have seen this when we started to drill down into the data in the previous lesson for the accessing of the file system. But if we start to go back into our Windows .storage, .application data, .current, we were working with the local folder before, but now we're going to take a look at the settings. So we're going to grab our local settings, and I'll go ahead and save that into a variable. So I'll say var local settings equal to that local settings. And then what I want to do is I want to save this name value pair into those settings. So in this case, I'll just simply access that via the local settings.values property, and this is once again a very simple name value pair. So we're going to use setting name as the name, and we're going to set it equal to the setting value, just like that. So that is enough for you to actually be able to save it. So once I've done that now, I'm actually going to go into the setting name, and I'm going to set its text to the empty string just to clear it out. And we'll do the same thing for the text setting value. So we'll clear those out. And now we have our retrieve button. So ultimately what I want to do is I want to read any of these name value pairs, these settings that have been saved, and then ultimately populate them into my list view. So let's go ahead now, and we're going to actually go through our local settings that we've got here. So we'll just copy this down to this method. And now that I have those local settings, what I want to do is I want to create a list of basically strings that are going to represent my settings. So we'll say var setting list is going to be equal to, and it's going to be a new list of strings. And in this case, all we're going to have to do is go into and look at our for each, and we'll say local settings, and we want to look at our values, and we want to look at all the keys. So we want to enumerate through all the keys found within those name value pairs. And once we find one, we're going to add to our setting list. We're going to add a new string that's ultimately just going to be a simple concatenation. So we'll use string.format, and we'll do the name : value. So for our key, we'll use key, and then for the value, we'll use local settings, values, and then we'll ask for the value for that particular key. So now we're going to have a list of all of these settings just easily formatted into strings, and then ultimately we want to put those into that list. So I can now say within my list of settings, I'm merely going to set its item source equal to my settings list. And that should be pretty good for now. So let's see where this gets us. So now we'll go ahead and hit F5. And once our application starts up, you can see now we have a very simple UI. So we'll say the name of our first one is going to be name. And then we'll type in here for the value, we'll call this Derek. And now we'll go ahead and save that. And now it blanked this out. And we'll go ahead and say that the next one is going to be learning. And then the value for this is going to be Windows Phone 8. And we'll go ahead and save that as well. So now that we've saved a few settings in there, we want to retrieve them. So we'll go ahead and hit the retrieve button. And as you can see here now, we've actually got some data in here so we can at least see, although it's a little bit small, we could adjust the size, but you can see here that we have learning, Windows Phone 8, and name Derek. And as you can see, they're actually in the reverse order that we put them in because it's actually being stored in alphabetical order because it's just a very simple dictionary or name value pair. And so when we grabbed those keys out, we grabbed them in alphabetical order. So as you can see, this is a very simple way to actually start to save some user settings or maybe even some application settings to your local storage to keep track of certain things that your consumer or your end user is actually doing, or maybe how they've actually configured your application to meet their specific needs. So I hope you find this helpful and use this in some of your upcoming projects.